Meine Damen und Herren, ich hoffe, Sie können mich gut hören. Zur heutigen Mosse-Lecture, der zweiten in diesem Winter, darf ich Sie sehr herzlich begrüßen und freue mich, dass Sie so zahlreich wiedergekommen sind. Diesmal möchten wir mit Ihnen Klassenfragen diskutieren und das impliziert auch die Frage, ob sich die Kategorie der Klasse aktuell neu aufdrängt und aufdrängen muss, weil die ökonomischen Realitäten das Schichtenmodell, das von der Soziologie lange bevorzugt wurde, widerlegen. Wer von Schichten spricht, darauf hat Josef Vogel beim Eröffnungsvortrag hingewiesen, geht von einer quasi geologischen Verfestigung von gesellschaftlichen Lagen aus, die sich wie stabile Gesteinsformationen aufeinander stapeln und distinkte, füreinander weitgehend undurchlässige Zonen bilden, in denen Wachstum und Prosperität unterschiedlich gut gedeihen. Der Klassenbegriff dagegen ist von einem ganz anderen Unruhetonus innerviert. Er hat eine polemische Note, er stiftet Unruhe und schlägt Lärm, weil er ein unverrückbares Nebeneinander von Schichten nicht gelten lässt. Klassen sind keine naturwüchsigen Gebilde, sondern historische Akteure, deren Schicksale aufs Engste miteinander verkoppelt sind. Ihre Kräfte wachsen und schwinden durch das Abschöpfen von Ressourcen des jeweils anderen. Und im Fall der Klasse der Beherrschten sind den Spielräumen zur Selbstgestaltung eben jene Grenzen gesetzt, die die herrschende Klasse ihnen zieht. Gegen diese Klassenverhältnisse, so lehrt Marx, kann man aber kämpfen, wenn man ein Bewusstsein für die Widersprüche entwickelt, die in ihnen wirksam sind und die Macht als Schlagkraft ausnutzt, die aus der Solidarisierung erwächst. Am utopischen Horizont winkte der Traum von einer klassenlosen Gesellschaft, in der die Arbeit dank der Vergemeinschaftung von Produktionsmitteln so verteilt ist, dass sie niemanden mehr verknechtet und in der ein jeder genug besitzt, um das eigene Leben frei zu gestalten und heute dies, morgen jenes zu tun. Also etwa morgens zu jagen, mittags zu angeln, abends Vieh zu züchten und nach dem Essen zu kritisieren, ganz nach Lust und Laune und ohne damit den Ehrgeiz zu verbinden, Jäger, Fischer, Hirte oder Kritiker zu werden. Dieser Traum des jugendlichen Marx aus der deutschen Ideologie, wenn er dann jemals ein Traum aller war und eben nicht nur der von Marx, hat wie alle Utopien der Vergangenheit längst Patina angesetzt. Und die Gegenwart der aktuellen Marktgesellschaften mit ihren Arbeitsformaten und Beschäftigungsbedingungen scheint davon so weit entfernt wie nie zuvor. Andreas Reckwitz hat in der letzten Mosse-Lecture mit breiten Strichen ein anderes Gesellschaftspanorama entworfen, in dem die Gesellschaft der Gleichen in den Konturen jetzt nicht mehr der klassenlosen Gesellschaft, sondern der nivellierten Mittelstandsgesellschaft mit wohlfahrtsstaatlichen Sicherungen und den Segnungen des Massenkonsums nur noch als kurzes Intermezzo vorkam. Als Interim, das mit der Nachkriegsära und ihren Wirtschaftswundern zu Ende ging und in der nostalgischen Vergoldung des Blicks zurück auf etwas Verlorenes, etwas sehnsüchtig Vermisstes, idyllischer erscheint, als es tatsächlich war. Für die westlichen Gesellschaften in der Welt 2.0 machte Reckwitz hingegen eine Vervielfältigung der Klassen aus. In seiner Skizze der Dreiklassengesellschaft lenkte er das Augenmerk dabei vor allem auf die Antagonismen innerhalb der Mittelklasse, auf das Entstehen einer neuen M-Klasse von Neubürgern mit der Attitüde von dauerkreativen Lebenskünstlern und der Beweglichkeit von Globetrottern in der postindustriellen Arbeitswelt, die, so seine These, die alte Mittelschicht mit Abstiegsängsten bedrohe und zu umso aggressiveren Besitzstandswahrungen verleihte. Der Klassenkampf stellte sich in dieser Perspektive nicht als Vereinigung von Arbeitern zur Rebellion gegen die Verursacher ihrer Verelendung dar, sondern als Abgrenzungsgefecht besorgter Bürger nach unten, als Stellvertreterkrieg der noch ganz gut Situierten gegen die Schwächsten, denen sie die Schuld an der gefühlten eigenen Prekarisierung aufladen und den kulturellen Kapitalverlust, den sie in der Konkurrenz mit der neuen M-Klasse erleiden, auf diese Weise kompensieren. Um die verunsicherte Mittelklasse wird es auch in dem Vortrag von Michèle Lamont gehen, die heute Abend unser Gast ist. Michèle Lamont wird den Blick auf die US-amerikanische Gesellschaft richten und erläutern, warum an deren aktuellen Krisen die vergangenen Träume nicht unschuldig sind. Allen voran der American Dream mit seinem Versprechen, nicht nur Traum zu bleiben, sondern durch Mut und Fleiß für jeden Wirklichkeit werden zu können. Michèle Lamont, oder Lamont, wahrscheinlich spreche ich es ganz falsch aus, will diesen Traum, wenn ich ihre Position richtig verstehe, keineswegs für allemal verloren geben, aber sie will darauf hinweisen, dass die Verfolgung des individuellen Glücksstrebens, des Pursuit of Happiness, das die amerikanische Declaration of Independence ja zu den unveräußerlichen Menschenrechten zählt, für all jene fast unerschwinglich teuer geworden ist, die nicht nur aufgrund ihrer Zugehörigkeit zur Klasse der Arbeiter, sondern auch aufgrund von Stigmata der Rasse mit Jobs im Niedriglohnsektor Vorlieb nehmen müssen. Welche Ressourcen, so lautet Ihre Frage, können diese Massen von Deklassierten nutzen und welche Ressourcen können andere für sie auftun, um die eigene Situation nicht völlig hoffnungslos werden zu lassen? Michèle Lamont lehrt an der Harvard University und sie hat dort mit ihren Arbeitsschwerpunkten ganz unterschiedliche fachliche Standbeine ausgebildet. Sie ist Professorin für Soziologie, aber auch für African and African American Studies sowie für European Studies. Von 2006 bis 2009 war sie Vorsitzende des Council for European Studies und danach 2 Jahre lang von 2016 bis 2017 auch Präsidentin der American Sociological Association. Ihre Forschungsinteressen gelten den symbolischen und sozialen Grenzen der Ungleichheit und den Spielarten der klassenbedingten Distinktion. Von ihren Publikationen möchte ich das 2002 bei Harvard University Press erschienene Buch The Dignity of Working Men, Morality and the Boundaries of Race, Class and Immigration erwähnen. Außerdem den gemeinsam mit Graciela Moraes Silva, Jessica Welburn und anderen herausgegebenen Band Getting Respect, Responding to Stigma and Discrimination in the United States, Brazil and Israel von 2017. Im Sommer diesen Jahres ist das Sonderheft der Zeitschrift Daedalus zum Thema Ungleichheit als multidisziplinärer Prozess erschienen, das sie mit Paul Pearson gemeinsam herausgegeben hat. Das Thema ihres heutigen Vortrags lautet In Search of Hope, the Current Crisis of American Class Society. Dear Michèle Lamont, we are very glad to have you here at Humboldt University and we are looking forward to your talk. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Ethel, Professor Matala de Mazza, for the very kind introduction. I only wish I spoke German to be able to understand what you said. It's a real honor to be here tonight. I thank Klaus Scherpe as well as the Mosse-Lecture Committee and the Mosse Foundation for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm going to talk about a book in progress, a book that is written for the American audience, but I hope that it would also be of interest to Europeans. I'm very aware that each time I come to Europe, I'm very struck by how much Europeans are following what's happening in the US with a great deal of anxiety. And the book is an attempt to try to make sense of it. I'm Canadian. I lived in France from 78 to 82. I've written several books on France and the US. And I still look at the US as, and I lived in the US since 83, but I still look at the US as an outsider. I still have an accent. People very often ask me where I'm from, which always surprises me since I've lived there for so many years, and I have 3 kids who are American and Canadian. So this is the background against which I ask you to help me make sense of what I'm going to be talking about. If this is a book in progress, it also means that one of the reasons I've accepted to give this lecture today is because I look forward to your input. I'm still trying to figure things out. And a lot of what I'm trying to do is try to figure out how to move forward. As I was starting to put this lecture together, I talked to several of my colleagues about the way forward, where is there hope? And all these learned people told me there's no hope. So this is pretty discouraging. But still, as a student of cultural scripts, I'm very aware that hope is socially produced, that there are people, cultural producers, whose specialty is to create narratives, to create scripts, templates that people use in living their lives. These scripts are found in the world of binge watching, in the TV programs such as Orange is the New Black, the programs that are captivating the attention of the Gen Zs and the millennials, the generations of tomorrow. So I'm very interested in trying to see where they see the alternative if the American dream doesn't mean anything for them. And I'm trying to, in the book that I'm writing, next week I'm going to be interviewing the showrunner for the show Transparent, which features a trans person. And I'm really interested in understanding what resonates in the messages that he produces, he, she, they produce, and also the person who has invented the new Barbies. Barbies are now coming in 7 phenotypes. You also have a new trans Barbie. So we know that the key values of the Gen Zs are authenticity, inclusion, sustainability. They couldn't care less about the American dream because it means nothing to them. They know they're not about to buy a house. But they're trying to redefine what human relations are about. And I think we can observe what they're doing to understand a way forward, to the extent that what we have now is clearly not working for them and is not going to be working for them. So the lecture I'm going to present has 2 parts. The first part is diagnosis. The second part is solutions. And the solution has to do, my expertise is cultural sociology, which means that I understand meaning-making processes, how people make sense of the world. And I think we can also do that by studying the producers and diffusers of cultural meanings, which is what I'm going to try to do in the book in progress. So here we go. So to understand what I'm doing, I'm first mentioning 2 papers that I published over the last 2 years. Those of you who are sociologists and who are interested in the meta-theoretical models that are behind this talk, this being a talk which is more meant for a general audience, you can turn to these papers to have more background. But the basic goal is to develop a sociology of recognition and stigmatization processes. There's now an exploding literature on inequality. You would have to be blind not to be aware of this. The book of Piketty, Thomas Piketty, for instance, Capital in the 21st Century, enormous amount of attention. That literature is very much led by economists, and it focuses on patterns of distribution of resources, income, and wealth. I want to propose that we need to look with as much intent, seriousness, and a focus on cumulative knowledge, that is theory building, on processes of recognition and stigmatization. And this is the agenda I proposed in my presidential lecture to the ASA titled Addressing Recognition Gap. But this is, you know, the nitty-gritty of what academic research is about. This is the intellectual significance, or the pretend intellectual significance of what I'm doing. But the social significance is really the challenge of trying to broaden cultural citizenship so that it includes the largest possible number of co-citizens. The context in which I'm operating is the context of neoliberal advanced industrial societies, which are marked by a narrowing of criteria of worth or dignity, where being worthy increasingly means being economically successful. So that's the first concern. A certain concern would be the rigidification of symbolic and social boundaries, which is correlated with the growing xenophobia and a concomitant growing popularity of populism and conservative and right-wing parties in the US as well as a good part of Europe. So that's the first part of the talk. And the second part is really about the fact that we need new narratives. So this is about solution, new narratives of hope to extend cultural membership to the largest numbers of the society. And I will argue that this can be achieved by promoting a plurality of criteria of worth, not only criteria that have to do with material accumulation, but with various ways of being. Reframing stigmatized groups, that is the process of destigmatization, and also how to publicize ordinary forms of universalism, or what I called ordinary universalism or everyday cosmopolitanism. So, but we also need to understand how to produce and diffuse alternative criteria of worth in a public domain that is increasingly defined by the social media. The public domain today doesn't work the same as it did 30 years ago. So we need to come to grip with this, and I think we're still pretty far from this. So my goal is not, frankly, to be there as the intellectual, telling people how to think differently, but really more to stir the pot and to invite all of us to think collectively about how to do this, how to engage in a collective conversation about the way forward. So part one, we'll discuss neoliberal scripts of the self and their negative impact on the class spectrum in the US and the rigidification of group boundaries. So the talk is mostly about the US, while being aware that many countries, in some ways the American dream manifests itself in other countries. That is, the faith in meritocracy is increasing everywhere, as I will show you, at the same time as many countries, Germany included, France included, are defining their national identity very much against the US. So it's a little bit of a paranoid, schizophrenic situation. But I think we can read what's happening in the US as also telling us a little bit what may be ahead for their society. But to start with, I will begin with a discussion of resilience, and I will often have in references and footnotes some of the work that I'm drawing on. So here, this concept of resilience, by which I mean social resilience, I approach this as a capacity of group that are enabled by institutions, for instance, by policies or the law, and that send messages about who belong, who's worthy, who matters in a society. I'm also concerned with cultural repertoires that people have at their disposal to make sense of their reality, or the tools that they mobilize to buffer themselves from negative messages about themselves, against stigma. So one example would be, think about the 32 American states that were the first to pass a same-sex marriage law in the US. These states saw immediately a quite drastic decline in the number of attempted suicide among LGBTQ youth in American high schools. So that's an example where an institutional change is containing cultural messages about who's worthy that has a direct impact on people's lives. Same-sex marriage were not justified by the need to broaden cultural membership. Policymakers know nothing about this. They were justified by tax reasons, equal access, taxation policies that should apply equally to everyone. But it had immediate cultural effects in sending messages about who belongs. So my approach here is quite different from the large literature on individual resilience that has gained huge popularity. I presume that Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, became very popular here as well. It's all about the individual, the exceptional individuals who are able to pull themselves by their bootstrap and survive the huge challenges that the neoliberal world offers them. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the tools that society offers and the messages that it promotes about who's worthy. So hope is part of the story here because I understand hope as a rope, R-O-P-E. It feeds aspiration, especially when it is intersubjectively supported or shared. It's nice to be able to talk about phenomenology in Berlin. So I cannot say that when I talk in the US. So this importance of shared meaning is partly crucial in the work of Catherine Panther-Briggs, who's a medical anthropologist who studied children in refugee camps of Lebanon and Turkey. And she finds that the kids that prospered most were those who had at least one significant other with whom they could share an imagined future that would involve for them to move away from the camps and be able to continue study. And this ability to share required them looking beyond their immediate position, their individual. It considered shared understanding of the future. So in the American context, the big schema through which hope has operated for a long time is the American dream. It has operated as an extraordinarily powerful engine for most of the 20th century. It sent a lot of people to the US, many immigrants. It was a hope machine that proved remarkably effective at appealing to the hearts and minds to orient action and define behavior. So this is a case where meaning-making is real. It has real impact. It provided American citizens a normative sense of direction to their action. Their answer was build prosperity, the standard by which one would measure who belongs. The answer was who belongs? The successful. A notion of who deserves to be trusted. The answer? Those who try. And a definition of which groups are to be stigmatized. The answer? People who are lazy and who lack self-resilience. The message was clear. Many people were on board. Many experts of inequality today continue to be fixated on the American dream and the correlate, which is the notion that we should all be middle class. Being all middle class means we should all get a college degree. So policymakers are asking, how can we make more people middle class? How can we make sure that more people get a college degree? More people can buy a house, more people can become professionals and managers and enjoy the type of consumption or quote unquote comfort level accessible to the top 20% of the population. Yet, in this conversation, most people are simply overlooking the simple fact that 100% of the population cannot fit in the 20%, in the top 20% of the income distribution. And this is particularly the case in the context of growing inequality. I remind you that this is currently American society faces the most inequality it has faced since 1929. So in contrast to this widely spread view that basically structures the whole world of social science in America, I would argue that the American dream is a bankrupt idea, that it needs to be replaced by other narratives of hope. If we cannot replace it, since the faith in it is so deep and so deeply invested, at the very least, we need to supplement it with other narratives, which I'll describe. But let's return to neoliberalism. So, neoliberalism has spread very rapidly since the 1980s, primarily in the US, but also in Europe, as you can see here, from the election of Reagan and Thatcher on. So this figure here depicts the diffusion of the term based on the LexisNexis search on the content of online newspapers in the US and Europe from 1978 to 2017. And it shows a quite dramatic increase in the salience of the term over the last 5 years, with a big jump from 2015 to 16. When I started producing this graph, I thought it would be far less salient in the US than in Europe, but I was totally wrong. It has caught up. When I used the term 10 years ago, Americans really didn't know what we were talking about, but now they do. So the book, Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Era, which I just showed you a picture of, includes a first chapter, a quite brilliant chapter by the sociologist of development, Peter Evans, and the French cultural historian Bill Sewell, in which they define neoliberalism as operating a set of syncretic changes that manifest themselves quite differently across national contexts, but they always operate simultaneously at 4 levels: the economic, the political, the administrative, and the cultural level, to maximize market efficiency and the free exchange of goods. And in this specific talk, I'm exclusively concerned with the cultural aspects of the process, and more specifically, with the scripts of the self that have become widely institutionalized under neoliberalism. These are the recipes that are offered to us about what the ideal self looks like. And this ideal self is associated with values that are transmitted through the American dream and carried, represented by the American dream, with a focus on material success, competitiveness, as well as self-determination. I'm putting Trump here because many people think that he embodies these values, and I believe he would not be elected today if they didn't think that was the case. Meritocracy is not directly typically associated with neoliberalism, but I add it here because I think it's quite salient to our discussion. And its popularity is increasing enormously. It has to do with the notion that success is associated with hard work and is therefore deserved. Those who don't succeed are those who are too lazy. And you don't see very well here, but this is a figure showing the increased popularity of meritocracy, belief in meritocracy from 1930 to 2010 across a number of countries. And the summary of the figure is this. Basically, it increases everywhere. In all but 5 of the 23 countries studied, which are basically all advanced industrial societies, excluding the Asian countries. So it declines only in Austria, Canada, and France, and it increases in 15 countries, including Germany. So Germany is here. Germany is the second from the bottom. You can see quite acute increase. So in the US, to return to the US, there's plenty of evidence that support for the American dream remains very high. And the conditions that support this strong faith in the American dream, despite the fact that we have everyday evidence that, you know, growing inequality, people don't get what they deserve. Well, the term has become extremely ambiguous. It is dialogic. People put everything in it. Having a good family means the American dream. Having a clean house means the American dream. Having, you know, white picket fence is the American dream. So no one will say that they don't like the American dream because it has become synonymous with cultural membership. Here I list some of the other conditions. The fact that, in general, people think they will themselves be able to achieve it, even if most Americans will not be able to achieve it. And there's a large number of immigrants who come to the US specifically because they invest in the American dream. And indeed, when we look at attitudinal survey data on immigrants, they are the ones who like most the American dream. They have no ambivalent feelings toward it. Blacks will say, I like my Black American dream. They qualify it. So I think that it is very pernicious. It has a great impact on neoliberal scripts of class dynamic and symbolic boundaries. So what's happening is that with the accelerated diffusion of neoliberalism, these neoliberal scripts of self, emphasizing self-reliance, economic success, consumption, competitiveness, influence whether social class and social groups are perceived as worthy and stigmatized based on their association with the scripts. And this leads to group boundaries becoming more permeable. More specifically, on the one hand, the upper middle class, which is the group that demonstrates best the neoliberal values, college professionals and managers, their culture is becoming even more hegemonic and is consistently depicted by the media as having the most desirable set of values and the best lifestyle. Concomitantly, since this is relational, the classes that are perceived as least self-reliant, the poor and the working class, are becoming more stigmatized, with important ripple effect with various groups such as African Americans and illegal immigrants who are perceived as using a disproportionate amount of the collective resources. So we have a bifurcation, a growing recognition gap across the classes, which feeds the multiplication of recognition claims that have been at the center of public debates over the last 10 years. I'm thinking here of, in particular, Occupy, which was an attack against the 1%, Black Lives Matter, and the large movement that we see now in defense of immigrant rights. The case of Mythos is slightly different. But you notice that all these mega movements are all recognition movements. But there's other reasons why the American dream is pernicious. It's creating major health challenges for the middle class, the upper middle class, the alleged winner of this increased inequality. And it's also creating huge challenges for the working class and the poor. So what's happening across from the top 20% to the bottom? The upper middle class has seen a quite drastic decline in its fertility. They're having fewer kids because they want to give more resources to each of these precious little kids. They are putting a lot of resources behind sending them to college. They want those kids to go to the most prestigious colleges. People are very scared about downward mobility since 2008. So the upper middle class has become this huge helicopter parenting industry, and the fear of falling is spreading within the group with wide-ranging ramification. It's being worried about its ability to ensure the reproduction of its social position and is creating a huge amount of anxiety with a lot of mental health problems. So we know, studies have shown that the adults of the top 20% are facing a major mental health crisis. Money and work are cited as the most common sources of stress for American adults. And this crisis is probably strong in, you have the three groups there, and it's partly strong among whites. The white upper middle class being known as probably the group that has the strongest cultural membership in the US is also a group that is partly strongly affected, and some of the data shows that their mental health problem is as considerable as those in the lowest annual income group. So that is pretty puzzling, but that's the situation we face. The situation is partly bad among their kids. My students are college students. All colleges are facing huge demand for their mental health services. That's true whether you consider the top 1% of institutions or the lower echelons. And there's a major study made every year at UCLA, the UCLA National Survey of Freshmen, which shows an increase in the number of students surveyed who are feeling overwhelmed. This number has increased considerably from 85 to 2015. So they just feel like they are submitted to an enormous amount of pressure. So the alleged winner of this growing inequality are not doing that great. So the kids don't want to live the life of their parents. They are rejecting the life of hypercompetition. The objectives that their parents are defining for them are not the objective they want. They are looking elsewhere to find a life that is meaningful, and I think we need to listen to them. So despite all these obvious flaws, the lifestyle and behavior and the values of the upper middle class are repeatedly offered to everyone as the model to follow. So this has been shown by a historian of the mass media named Richard Butch, who has done a content analysis of 400 primetime American sitcoms for a total of 68 years of television. And he found that 90% of all the characters on this sitcom were either upper middle class or professionals and managers. Only 10% of them were working class, and in general, they were presented as buffoons, incompetent, immature, ignorant, and irresponsible. So think of The Simpsons, the typical case. A parallel analysis conducted on a sample of television program in Sweden, which included 32% of American programming, reaches similar conclusion. So an exposure to rags to riches stories in entertainment television has served to strengthen the American dream. And this type of entertainment has grown exponentially over the last decade. So a student of political communication named Unji Kim has shown that watching such program has a significant effect on believing in the American dream, particularly among Republicans and those who are politically optimistic. In fact, the effect of watching such program is as strong as that of being children of immigrants. So this may suggest that much of entertainment television, and it's true in particular of reality TV, think about the wives of Beverly Hills or the wives of everywhere else. It functions as a gigantic publicity machine for the distinctive scripts of the self that are associated with the neoliberalism that the upper middle class incarnates. So the working class simply does not find its reality represented in entertainment television. Entertainment television feeds a benevolent view of the rich with many implications for attitudes toward redistribution and social justice. Now, what's happening in the working class, and I basically, separate college-educated professionals and managers. That's what I define as the upper middle class, which probably includes most people in this room. The working class, blue-collar and low-status white-collar workers whose highest degree is a high school degree. I presume that there's no one like this in this room. These are the people who are not there, and these are the people who suffer the most from the current situation. In the early 90s, I interviewed blue-collar workers and low-status white-collar workers in Paris and New York, African-American and whites in New York, North African immigrants and whites in Paris, in this book, The Dignity of Working Man. And I argued that American workers were far more under the spell of the upper middle class than their French counterpart, given the relative absence in the US of cultural repertoire celebrating working class virtues such as solidarity. In the US, you don't have a history of working class resistance. You don't have republicanism, which promotes solidarity across class. You don't have Catholicism, which you have it, but it's far more marginal than it is in France, influencing basic beliefs about the importance of solidarity. So in the absence of republicanism, Catholicism, socialism, you have workers who are left much more to think of themselves as losers. They don't have an alternative. They don't have the alternative of valuing solidarity with people like them. Now, the French working class has changed a lot since I did these interviews in '93. With a colleague, Nicolas Duvaux, we were able to show a convergence in values between the French and the American working class, with the French workers now being much harsher toward the poor than they were in '93. I'll skip this. I can develop in the Q&A if you're interested. So the French workers, when I interviewed them, showed much more cultural distance and cynicism toward the upper middle class, whereas the American workers were much more likely to think of themselves as losers, and thinking of yourself as loser leaves you nowhere. So in this context, I think the American dream is increasingly becoming an impossible or a desperate dream. The dream has collapsed, and a large number of American workers are left empty-handed. So to measure yourself every day by the standard of middle-class consumption can only lead to self-destruction if it means that you want to access a status that is unattainable. And I think it leads us to the opioid epidemic that we're witnessing today, which is of gigantic proportion. So studies that are looking at American workers today find poors that are really at the bottom of the end of their rope. Think about Barbara Heidenreich's fear of failing. Fear of falling. Think of, what's his name? I'm blocking. Anyway, I believe that we need to think about ways in which we can diversify the criteria of worth, through which I had in mind Andrew Cherlin, who has a book titled Love's Labor's Lost, who also shows that American workers now are really marrying in fewer number. It's harder for them to be providers. Because of them, they're more and more isolated. They don't marry. They spend their life in their basement. They don't join the Knights of Columbus. The whole Robert Putnam Bowling Alone is largely a working class story of self-isolation. So they experience despair, and find refuge in self-isolation. So I think it's important that we find a solution to help them rekindle a collective sense of worth. This is not to deny the importance of material scarcity. None of what I say denies the fact that having no money is terrible. On the other hand, if we are in a context in which the only criteria that is ever offered to you as a medium through which you will measure your worth is how much money you make, then you're really screwed. So that's where I think we need to think about how to engineer and how to create or maximize the visibility of other criteria of work, that we need to move from having to being as criteria. How are we going to do this? Before I get into this question, I'll just emphasize one more of the pernicious effect the current situation, which is that the groups that are not able to demonstrate self-resilience are becoming even more stigmatized. So it is the case for the poor, as manifested in, the low support for redistribution that is characteristic of American society. Lots of resentment of welfare recipients. To put things simply, in the US, the poor are extremely stigmatized, much more than they are in many European countries. But other groups that are associated with the poor, that are also viewed as lacking in self-reliance, are also increasingly stigmatized. So this is true, for instance, these figures here is based on a data set called the American National Election Study that offers evidence from feeling thermometers. The question is, how warmly do you feel toward these groups? So you can see the first group, quite a clear decline in warm feeling toward African Americans, far more evident among Republicans than among Democrats. You find something less drastic for Republicans toward Chicanos and Hispanics. And then you have illegal immigrants. And interestingly, gay and lesbians are not facing the same stigmatization, but they are often depicted as two-income, no kids. They're not associated with the poor the way that these other groups are. So these are more evidence of the need to try to address the situation we face, and it becomes imperative to consider how to sustain hope and a broader definition of self-worth that will keep people from, self-destruction, which is what we're seeing now. So I simply want to talk about a few possible approaches. The first one, in all cases, let's think together about the public sphere. You can call it the public sphere, you can call it the public domain. It's very neo-Durkheimian, the cultural representations through which we perceive our imagined community, who's part of it, who's worthy in it. The approach I'm proposing here is very different than people who are writing about tribalism or pro-social attitudes. The literature and psychology in general in this field tend to really presume a kind of human nature, that we are predisposed to being pro-social or not. Instead of starting with the human nature, I really don't believe in human nature. I'm thinking in terms of the cultural scripts, the repertoire through which we perceive what our society is about. And I presume that these can be engineered. These can be, altered. And that's basically what I'm proposing we pay attention to. So, and I'm proposing a kind of multi-pronged approach to produce new narratives of worth. And there's many different elements that are involved in this. So one example would be the role of employers who, when they are promoting work-family balance, they have family leave policy, they are implicitly sending to their employees the fact that they're not only there as production machines, that they're also there as caregivers, as parents, as friends, as grandparents who need to attend to other people's needs. So that's an example of how to institutionalize a society that is based on more criteria of membership than simply our capacity to produce and make money. And it presumes that collective identity is collectively engineered. There's nothing original here. Think about classical books like Anderson's Imagined Community, on and on and on. Second approach really consists in looking at groups that have been destigmatized and failed case and positive case. And let's see how the positive case worked. So I'll describe one example of this. And what do ordinary people think? Well, that's partly crucial in a context where so many workers are watching Fox News and so many workers are not at all connecting to the political ideology that the Democratic Party is offering them in the US. We need to understand better how the non-college educated understand what defines equality, and they live in a totally different world than most people who write about inclusion. They couldn't care less about most of what we write, and not only that, they dislike deeply the class habitus with which we deliver it. So I think we need to really connect and understand better where they come from. And frankly, I have no idea how we can convince them that there's an ounce of sincerity in a project of social change when the class habitus that are at work are so orthogonal to each other. I just read a wonderful book titled Fox Populism, which explains the success of Fox News, the amazing success of Fox News, by the fact that they were able, the medium was able to convince the working class that watches them that Trump is their allies, not because Trump promotes policies that advantages them, but because Trump has a class habitus that is very similar to theirs. So as long as I think we cannot really capture what this means, and the fact that, in fact, those workers have no ideology. You know, I just read another book about workers in coal country where when they are interviewed who they're going to vote about, they say, oh, Sanders or Trump, I don't care. They don't see the difference between the political ideology because all the institutions of political socialization, such as unions, have disappeared. So there's no notion that, in fact, you cannot simultaneously want to vote for these two people since they stand for something so drastically antagonist to one another. So what is left is the affect. It's the way of speaking. It's the way in which Trump constantly makes fun of us, of the upper middle class, which really resonates with workers and with the 40% of Americans who never vote. So as long as we don't take seriously what this 40% is about and understand the extent to which they are you know, disaffiliated with the political world and the world of the college-educated, I think we're not going to go anywhere. And the fourth part is really kind of a program and intellectual agenda about how to move forward. So let's talk about the first element, which is really the role of cultural intermediaries of all types, which includes social scientists. Which really need to think very systematically about how to promote different criteria of membership. So I'll give you one example, one very successful example. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, when he was Prime Minister of Canada, when I was young, he was a real federalist. He deeply disliked the Quebec nationalist movement. So he decided that one of the ways to get rid of them is to promote a new national identity, which would, instead of presenting French Canadians, my group, as one of the two founding nations of Canada, instead we would have a multinational country, multicultural nation that would present, for instance, the Ukrainian immigrants who lived in southern Saskatchewan, one of the western provinces, as equally Canadian as the French Canadians. And then he mobilized the state apparatus, you know, summer festivals, you know, public interest ads on TV nonstop. We're a multicultural nation, to the point that you ask any Canadian today, what's the difference between the US and Canada? And the closet English Canadian in this room, there's always many, will say we're multinational, we're multicultural. So it really works. So this is a case of collective engineering of an identity that was extremely successful and that drew on many types of cultural supports. So we can look at this as an example of success. Those who are in favor of this policy will say this is a great policy because it demonstrates how a plurality of criteria of membership, multinational, is much more inclusive, and it worked because now more people feel that they are part of the nation. The English Canadians who were at the top of the WASPish hierarchy have been displaced by a broader us. So that's a good lesson in the engineering of cultural citizenship. And you saw in the US many responses. For instance, when Trump banned entry to citizens from 7 Muslim-majority countries to the US a few months after being elected, you had a large number of churches that mobilized in protest, the Unitarian churches, for instance. Hall made, big posters in Arabic and other languages celebrating immigrants. So the pushback against messages of inclusion and the promotion of discourse of solidarity has been, all in the US as well as Canada, a way to create more groupness. So in order to think about how to move forward, one of the things that I'm thinking about, that I'm doing actually in the book on which I'm working, is to look at the emergence of a plurality of narratives of belonging. So what I've noticed from being the mother of 3 young adults is how much in their network of friends, inclusion has come to be extremely central. They want to relate to individuals as people. They constantly emphasize the way in which they're pansexual, their friendships are, they want to be blind to race and to class, to a large extent, and also to sexuality and authenticity is crucial. They want to relate in a very genuine way to people, and they very much reject class boundaries. So I think we can look at what are the cultural producers who are making these cultural repertoires so unavoidable to this generation. And here I'm talking about the upper middle class. I don't know how it's working for children of the working class, and I'll get to this a little bit later. But one of the things I'm doing in the book that I'm currently working on is to very systematically look at people who are engineering the media that are most popular in that generation to try to understand what drives them, thinking that they are announcing for us in part what is the future. A second approach would be to compare groups that are stigmatized, how they have become destigmatized. So in the paper that is cited here, we did a very systematic analysis of the secondary literature of 3 groups. The very successful group is people living in HIV/AIDS. Those of us who were adults in 82, 83, when the AIDS crisis broke, you will remember how deeply scared people were of people with HIV/AIDS. There was a question of, really finding ways to isolate them because people thought you could catch AIDS by touching a handle that had been touched by someone who had AIDS. This is a group who's been very deeply destigmatized in a very short period of time. Over 30 years, these kinds of warm surveys that I showed you demonstrate that. Another group that is absolutely not getting destigmatized are the obese. There's been campaigns. In this paper, we draw on books such as Abigail Sagi, What's Wrong with Fat, which shows that massive campaigns to destigmatize the obese in the US have failed miserably. So one question we ask is, what are the conditions for the destigmatization? And we show that in the successful case, you have had very strong alliance between essentially knowledge workers, social scientists, legal and medical experts who have worked very closely with social movement to demonstrate that the group in question was not dangerous and to do public interest campaign to diffuse this knowledge. So it's a group that has been successfully reframed, and that has not happened in the case of people labeled as obese. The case of African Americans is a case of mixed success. Which remains very segregated spatially and institutionally, although the norms of racism have changed quite a bit, with much more of stigma toward expressions of blatant racism. So the model that we came up with is something like this, which is to say the destigmatization, and this is really an argument against, I don't know if you have this here, the implicit association test, which is a really stupid test that organizations are forcing people to take, like universities, like all of us academics in the US have to take this stupid test, where they're showing you a picture of a black and a white person and they measure how fast you are pushing on buttons, good, bad. And the goal of this is to make you aware that you are racist. And the idea that if you become aware that you're racist, the next time you serve on a hiring committee, you'll be much more careful to not be racist. So it puts all the guilt on the individual, and it tells everyone, even good people like you can be racist unknowingly. Well, I think the problem of American racism is not located between people's ears. It's an institution. And we need to think about about transforming the frames through which we perceive people. And this is done at the level of the cultural engineering. So that's why we wrote this paper, to really try to think more systematically and structurally about the transformation of schemas that require the mobilization of cultural resources, which are part of the cultural structures, actors, action, etc. So that's the second part of the agenda. And a third part, and this I think, concretely, people who are studying social movements, the Women's March, there's a lot of social movements, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, are immediately relevant in the transformation of cultural frames. The third approach is really more relevant to the non-college educated. So when I was writing The Deity of Working Man, I spent a lot of time interviewing workers, blue-collar workers from North Africa, whose job it was to, let's say, clean phone booths. There were phone booths there, but it's terrible. It smelled like pee, especially during the summer, worst job in the world. Or, putting asphalt on roofs, really terrible jobs. And I was quite young and naive. I went around interviewing them in their rooms, etc. And we had really amazing exchanges, basically questions that had to do with what makes us equal as human beings, or even what makes us similar, or what makes us compatible. And these men often didn't have more than 2 or 3 years of school, so the kind of metaphors that they used to talk about how they understand people as similar were very much drawn from naturalistic metaphors of everyday life. Like, we're all like stars in the sky, equally insignificant in God's eyes. We all have to get up in the morning to buy bread. We all spent 9 months in our mother's womb. We all have 10 fingers. The kind of, points of convergence that I would never have thought about. But in their everyday experience of the world, this is what they think brings people together. Or the fact that we're all children of God. That's a very powerful notion that brings a lot of people together. So I think in terms of thinking about how to feed repertoires of hope, we really need to reach people, the non-college educated, where they are, which means doing far more research. Well, that's what I'm talking about, because that's what I know how to do. But to really understand where do they start from when it comes to thinking about equality and inclusion. One of the big problems is that I think the literature from the Enlightenment has fed so much of our thinking about equality. And this is so disentangled, separate, far away from how most people who are not college educated think about such things. So I think we have really to revisit a lot of the assumptions there. And I've written articles promoting what I call ordinary universalism as a step toward that. Here I list also as a form of equality that really puzzled me the first time it's an American worker in Elizabeth, New Jersey, who told me, well, if you can buy a house and I can buy a house, we're equal. As a former Marxist, that really blew my mind, because I didn't know that money could make people equal. But this is a case where consumption, the fact of being able to get credit, was for this person a basis of equality. But the notion that there are good and bad people in all races is a very powerful notion. The notion that morality is universal is also very powerful. So I think in terms of how to foster narratives of hope for the future, we, the thinking class, need to be far more aware of how our thinking is class-based, so that we're better able to first stop being so elitist, and second, go a little bit further toward connecting with people where they are. And finally, I think in terms of scholarship, there's an enormous amount of work, interdisciplinary work, that needs to be done in terms of understanding how ideas and cultural frameworks take shape and diffuse. And I think this needs to be really a major interdisciplinary endeavor, because none of the relevant specialty has the knowledge needed to understand how this works, especially given, the very pervasive and growing influence of social media, where we really most of us don't understand what's happening at all. So this is a kind of, collaboration that I think will be needed if we want to move forward, because it's not only a question of how institutions diffuse models, as I have described in the case of reality television, but there's also the question of roles of rituals in appealing to emotion. The question of how resonance operates culturally is a question that is attracting a lot of attention, and I think we need to do more. So in conclusion, I think the call for action here is really to understand how crucial recognition is to the agenda ahead. I'm very happy that economists are focusing on redistribution as one side of the coin of inequality, but the recognition processes, I think we have a long way before we have a sum of accumulated knowledge about recognition that slightly parallels what we already know about distribution processes, and I hope that more of us will take this as an agenda. And we need to think more systematically about how to mobilize, but I should add diffuse what we know from social science about how to broaden cultural membership. And what I've seen in the context of the American Sociological Association is a lot of identity politics. As Trump is in power, you know, you have a lot of fine distinctions that are being drawn among people on the left about who's right about what. And I think that just as we are, many of us now are obsessed with discussing who should be the right candidate for the Democratic Party, I think the main consideration should be let's elect who will get Trump to lose. So I think when it comes to thinking about how to move forward in the social sciences, we also need to think about how to create frameworks that are more inclusive so that we can bring more on board the 40% of the American population that's not voting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your inspiring talk and also for the broad range of material you presented to us. I think concerning the solutions you suggest, there's nothing to object, right? So we're all of the same opinion that things need to be done. Nonetheless, I'd like to ask some questions concerning some points you made in your talk. I wonder how actually to bring together the diagnosis that the support for meritocracy has increased and even skyrocketed over the last decades, and your observation that the American dream has turned into a nightmare, especially for those who, from an economic point of view, are able to live up to it, but suffer from the stress caused by, you know, by doing so. It seems to me that this situation is totally different from the one of the stigmatized part of the population for whom maybe the American dream functions perfectly, but they have to realize that it's not dependent on them to fulfill it. Right? So I'm wondering if you say we need a new narrative, if you would say we need different narratives for those groups or a one narrative for all of them, because the American dream has gone bankrupt entirely. I think there is a certain contradiction between the data you presented and the conclusion you drew from it.
An early version of the talk was even more damning about the American dream, and I have students who are immigrants who convinced me that actually we should keep the American dream, but be much more circumspect about it, and what we need, in fact, are other dreams that would complement the American dream. And I think they're right, because we know that it works very well for children of immigrants who tend to do much better, not only to outperform academically, but in terms of other indicators of well-being, like physical and emotional well-being. They do better than their American-born peers. So it does some good things in terms of, but it is not a script that works for everyone, and certainly pushed to the degree of anxiety with which a lot of the members of the upper middle class currently experience it, it becomes extremely, you know, negative. So.
Another thing that intrigued me as a somebody who deals with literature was the fact that part of your material was a study on TV comedy series. And I was wondering, because you mentioned them as a measure for the representation of class, I wonder if the study took into consideration that are also genre boundaries to tell certain stories, right? Because, I mean, to have a sitcom, you need to have a job where you are able to sit and talk and not only to sleep and recover because you have 3 jobs to do in a row. So I think there is a correlation between the class represented and the genre. And I mean, of course, you have tragedies like The Wire from East Baltimore, but then you either need the money to purchase the DVD or have the money to subscribe to HBO to watch it. I mean, that's the major difference.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, I think I would have to, I have a student who did for me an analysis of all the shows that are most popular in the Gen Zs. We have not looked at differences across social classes, and I would have to look at this more finely to be able to ascertain. I'm sure a number of programs, I mean, are watched massively across social classes, so one would have to focus specifically on those that cross class boundaries. But I will ask this Yoonji Kim, who did the study, if she has information on this.
And then if I understood you correctly, you were very much advocating for seeing a kind of secular spiritual of the equality of all men that are created equal as children of God. And I wonder how this fits together with the thing that you called collective engineering of society, which is not exactly the same, because the last thing, in a more or less older terminology, you would say it's ideology production, is more leading towards the idea of a definite society, either the Canadian or the American, where you have some kind of also national narrative as well. And how do you see the correlation?
As you could probably surmise from the tone I took when I was describing to you the Pierre Elliott Trudeau example, I mean, you know, dominant ideology, engineering from the top, part of me is extremely, you know, cynical about this. And I'm very cynical of us, you know, academics, engineering repertoires for the rest of society. It smacks of, you know, the technocratic society, which none of us like. But that's why I introduced the talk by saying this is more of an invitation to converse. What I hope is when, you know, I have no illusion the book will be written for the reading public, since that's who buys books. But to the idea of having even the reading public engage in a conversation around this beyond the usual circle, I think, would be helpful. I've decided to sign this book with a fairly trade, the same person who actually published Notorious RGB, with the idea that it would be read by non-academics. So the challenge I'm giving to myself now is to try to read it in such a way that the non-converted might be, or even people who don't read books often might be tempted to read this book. So we will see whether I'm capable of doing this, but I've decided to give it a try because I think in the current moment, I mean, frankly, it's politics. That got me to think we really need to be able to talk to other people than ourselves. Those of you who are fans of the old critical theory school will notice that, you know, the previous paper was titled From Having to Being, and the inspiration for this paper was One-Dimensional Man by Marcuse. So, and you have, you know, Eric Fromm in the background, etc. I think the idea of trying to think about broadening criteria of membership is something very important that is not part of everyday conversation, just as material criteria of membership are becoming ever more important. So I don't know, maybe it's not the case as much in Berlin, since you guys are so countercultural, but certainly, you know, the world I live in, I'm now living on the Upper East Side, you can imagine, it's extremely unavoidable. So I think it's worth at least to have a conversation about it. And, you know, the transformation, I don't know what's going to come out of it. What do you think?
I definitely want to invite the public also to enter into the conversation. I see a hand rising up.
You are using the language of engineering, and you probably have already met all these objections against the vision behind, but still it's necessary to ask that question. You probably distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate means of engineering in that sense. Brainwashing is not what you have in mind, and you don't have in mind tranquilizers for the poor. Let them eat Prozac, so then they will feel better and they think they have a good life. So that's, I guess it's not your intention. But still, it's the major question is your strategy of solution not a deviation from the necessity of redistributing wealth, providing better infrastructure, better education, better health, and so minimal wages and so. So it's a kind of culturalism that creeps into your solution that makes someone a little bit suspicious.
The last version of this paper, From Having to Being, I rewrote it and added every 3 paragraphs. This does not mean that we want to get people asleep at the wheel. We acknowledge that, you know, basic needs are essential, blah, blah, blah. This is not to, and I mean it. I think what's happening with the long struggle between materialism and culturalism is that culturalism is often given short shrift. I mean, the fact that there's a semiotic dimension to social life that is always present and that is unavoidable doesn't mean that material necessities are not there. And I think the trick as a cultural sociologist is to be able to talk about the former without denying the centrality of the latter. And there's plenty of very powerful argument. I mentioned earlier William Sewell, who has a classical paper, The Duality of Structures, which shows very well how material needs, you know, resources, material resources do not exist without being also cultural resources. So that's where I position myself. And I have a paper titled What is Missing? Cultural Processes in the Making of Inequality, which advocates dealing with as much systematicity and seriousness and avoidance of repetition. Because a lot of the cultural sociology literature is enormously repetitive. Instead of people building on each other, everyone repeats the same thing time and again, which means that the literature is not going anywhere. There's no, in terms of legitimizing the literature scientifically, that is to make a case for intellectual significance, it's very difficult because people don't feel obligated to acknowledge what has been said again before them. So that's where I stand. I mean, it's pretty simple.
Other questions on the floor? I see 2 hands over there.
Thank you so much for your talk. Contrary to the gentleman, I felt kind of sympathetic to this idea of collective engineering in the sense of the operation on the semiotic level, because I think it has immense importance, as well as the media. I think it has immense importance of how we perceive the world. And I would like to ask if you could give an example of how do you imagine maybe using some sort of sociological imagination on the individual level of maybe some new content or some new policy structure, which you have mentioned some ideas. How do you imagine these being implemented and creating like an immediate effect? I'm imagining sort of a scene. Do you have a scene in your idea how these new effects would take place in the circumstances of this cultural change? Thank you.
This is a little complicated. How would I say? I think there's a huge literature on media effect, for instance, on the impact of violence on TV, on actual violent behavior, or video gaming and violence, or video gaming and addiction. And as far as I know, the findings are quite mixed and all over the place. I mean, I don't want to put myself in the position of adjudicating, but I find that the piece of evidence I gave you on the correlation, it's not direct causation, but correlation between the 32 states that passed same-sex marriage and the decline in number of suicide attempts among LGBTQ youth in high school, to be very telling. So, and here I'm inspired theoretically by the work of John Mayer, the world polity literature, neo-institutionalism, which is all about the diffusion at the macro level of scripts of the self. So if you live in an environment where women are penalized for taking maternity leave, it creates a far more adverse environment for women at work than it is if you live in an environment where first they're not called maternity leave, but family leave, and there's a lot that is done to destigmatize this practice. So we could give you many, I have friends at Harvard who did a study of what happens when workers in the health sector are given time to take care of their dependent, and they find that the number of the absenteeism decreases drastically, and the level of loyalty to the employer increases significantly because they don't think that they're treated as human beings to the extent that the employer acknowledges that they have other needs, like taking care of their kids and their parents, you know. So there's a humanitarian, you know, it humanizes the workplace. So there's a lot of studies like this. Now, what I would go away from is the whole nudging literature. I was reading a study this afternoon where it's really, to me, to my view as a cultural sociologist, kind of very simplistic, where, you know, you have people read little vignettes in the context of an experiment that makes salient immigrants, and then you ask them questions about distribution of welfare to low-income African Americans, and it has an inverse effect on their support. Well, to me, this whole nudging literature is kind of, in some ways, meaningless to the extent that it presumes that exposing someone to reading one vignette will have an impact on their worldview. And it has an approach to causation that is really too, you know, proximate, and it ignores the effect of what does your brother think, and who did you have a conversation with yesterday night, and who was your favorite, you know, politician, and how often are you listening to Sanders, etc. So I think this explosion of interest in a nudging literature calls for really rethinking these things. And, you know, I've written about this, others have written about the conception of causality that is behind it. I don't know if it has become as pervasively influential here in Berlin or in Germany as it has in the US, but I think in general, if we think about the ecology of influence of the social sciences in North America, the convergence between behavioral economics and cognitive science and economics is really marginalizing Verstehen as a method, marginalizing the other social sciences in a way that is very worrisome, because it means that the sociological imagination is really falling out of view entirely. So one of the things I'd like to do with this book is to use the book in part to make people aware of such things, to say, you know, when we're talking about nudging at the individual, you know, intracranial level, you ignore all these broader cultural templates to which people are exposed in their everyday life, which has huge impact on how we think about cultural membership. So if Trump repeatedly vilifies undocumented immigrants, it has been shown to be directly correlated with xenophobia in the U.S. You know, he's feeding it every day. Same thing with racism against African Americans. So when he talks about cities such as Baltimore, who everyone knows is inhabited by low-income African American, and he describes it as vermin infested, you know, it doesn't take much of a leap for a lot of racist people to think that that's who he's talking about. So there's a huge booming literature right now in political psychology focusing exactly on this.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed the broad view on it. So my question is kind of twofold. One part goes a little bit what we heard before on the term of engineering, and I would like to ask you, by whom? So who's the conductor when we talk about engineering, or how many conductors do we have? And I would like to go a little bit into what you mentioned at one part in your talk, that youth is playing a critical role really to the future. And then the second part is that you also just said, well, we have some solutions maybe academia can do, but then academia is not the one only to talk to the people. So how much do we need of a working together of academia and agencies? So you mentioned Marcuse, so I'm thinking of Angela Davis and others who do both academia as well as activism. So maybe, yeah, maybe this is what I'm thinking about, activism in youth and how that can be part of the whole engineering process.
Yes, I should not have used the word engineering. I started the talk by using the word I want to stimulate an exchange or conversation, which is really what I want to do, because I know that the word engineering pushes all the anti-technocratic buttons, which I share with you. When I think about the movement currently that are creating most enthusiasm, it's certainly the climate change movement. The visit of Greta to New York had an extremely powerful effect on the American youth. It also is feeding the doomers. You know, there's a lot of doomers, a lot of young people who don't want to have children and who do not want to vote, who are feeling, you know, the OK boomers movement, which is very much about, you know, throwing a few pebbles at my generation. So I think that who the conversation should be about, as suggested in the study on the destigmatization, I think we really need to look more at the social movements. But at the same time, their allies are the knowledge producers, are the legal, medical, health experts, and the social scientists to play and this is shown. There's a lot of studies on the transformation of the framing of social problems. That's a classical literature in sociology. And all of them point to these kinds of collaboration between various. So what I can do, and maybe some other social scientists can do, is kind of diffuse the literature we know around this. And, you know, you think about the anti-smoking movement. How did it become so powerful? Well, it was a convergence between knowledge specialists and citizens organized. So that's how I think about this.
You also mentioned that youth is really depressed, so we put, well, the helicopter parents and others kind of look into youth being educated and having the best chances to attend college and universities, but then you also mentioned that youth is depressed at early age when they actually start, and that actually fits what I saw in the US and Australia, that youth at the age of 18, 19 with the best degrees and best universities are depressed and addicted to, say, playing at night or whatever. So the knowledge is not really kicking in or kind of making use of, because youth is depressed by the expectations of the parent generation. So how then, I mean, I totally agree with you, but how do we engage youth to be free from those burdens, but using knowledge to be also part of the activism we need to change society? I mean, you know, I have an answer, but you know, that's the question that really pops in my mind.
Well, I think as far as the US is concerned, one step is to make people more aware of the craziness that their anxiety is leading us toward. You know, there's a popular book that was published titled Excellent Sheeps, to alert parents that what they were in the process of producing with their obsession of getting their kids in the most, you know, prestigious university were excellent sheeps, as opposed to critical thinkers. I have a graduate student who actually did this dissertation comparing private and public upper middle class schools in Boston and in Berlin. And what he found in Berlin is the fact that students, because students are guaranteed a spot in universities, many more but not necessarily their first choice. So they may go and spend a year traveling in Australia while waiting to get their spot. So he studies them in their last years of gymnasium, and because in the US, these are the years they prepare to go to the university, they're totally going bananas, you know, smoking a lot of marijuana and working like crazy, especially now that marijuana is legal in many states. It creates a kind of, you know, schizophrenia. And but the youth, he finds that the youth here, maybe it happens more earlier before admission to gymnasium, but it creates, you know, the parents are way more relaxed when it comes to pushing their kids. Also because, and this is something I think he's not done entirely, I mean, to what extent in the US higher education has served as such a machine of upward mobility. It's more democratically accessible, whereas here I think his argument is partly that it's still more tied to an upper middle class culture. So this means that it's still viewed more as a class privilege, and therefore people are more relaxed about it, because a lot of people who don't feel they have the resources to pursue it don't pursue it, whereas in the US, even, you know, there's studies by Carolyn Tyson that shows that low-income African-American, you ask them about their future, they all say, I want to get a college degree, whether or not they know even how to apply to college, whether there are people in their environment who can teach them how to apply to college, even teach them how do you take the SAT, these basic exams. So the connection between means and ends is totally abstract for a great many students in the US who still think they need to follow this path, which is much more differentiated here given the vocational system. But many people would say the vocational system keeps a lot of working class people away from higher education, which also has a lot of problems. All this to say, I don't know anything about your system, I'm just saying.
There's another hand going up there.
Great talk, thank you. I'd like you to expand a little bit more on the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis, is it affecting mainly working class people because they are less resilient to the lure of drug-induced states to withstand or to supplement their version of the American dream by a pipe dream? It started all with prescription drugs, didn't it? Right? Okay.
Okay, I'm not an expert on this topic. The person who has written on this, the persons who have written on this who are most influential are Anne Case and Angus Deaton, both economists. And they talk about it mostly as a disease of the lower middle class and the working class, and it's more salient in the states that have been desindustrializing. Another important book is titled Dying of Whiteness, and it focuses on 4 Midwestern states where it has been particularly pervasive. And yes, it came through overprescriptions of drugs that were originally painkillers, but in communities where there was very little control and a lot of pushing from the pharmaceutical industries that wanted to push their sales. Now there's other drugs that are far more popular in the upper middle class, such as heroin, that are not viewed as broadly criminalized as some of the drugs that had been more popular among in lower income populations. There's a large literature about the ways in which cracks was criminalized, while heroin consumption was very high and not as criminalized. The literature on the increase in incarceration in the US, Alexander's book, for instance, really makes a big case of that. So,
thank you very much for your talk. To give some background, I found out about your works when I started to study, to analyze the inequalities between, within nations, between countries, and specifically academic inequalities. And I found your term about recognition gap very helpful to explain that. So I wonder if this solution you offered and the others that could be developed to shorten the recognition gap and to resolve it between the classes can be also helpful then to resolve this recognition gap in the more broader global sense between countries and nations. Thank you.
I don't know if I would apply. I think it is possible. I mean, when you think about the term settler colonialism, which is probably the term that is most widely used now. I mean, when I was younger, it was all about imperialism. And people were far more concerned with the structural characteristic of dependency and uneven exchange. I'm thinking those of us here in the room who are familiar with Samir Amin and the whole, Marxist imperialism literature. In my environment right now, the alternative frameworks are very much about settler colonialism, but you have also lasting influence of the work of Fanon and others. I mean, I would not want necessarily to, the reason I developed this term recognition gap is in a context in the US where there's a lot of concern with racism, and very appropriately so, since it's a society where slavery is the major divide. But the book Getting Respect, from which this paper, the paper on the recognition gap, emerged, was a comparison of the US, Brazil, and Israel. In Israel, you have a context where the dominant population is white. It's, Jewish people against Palestinians. So it means that the term, you cannot just focus on white hegemony and capture what's happening there. So just as critical race theory is gaining a lot of influence in the American context, I wanted to emphasize the fact that the focus on the black-white opposition does not work universally. And in Canada, for the longest time, including when I was growing up, the main divide people talked about was the ethno-linguistic divide. First Nations were there, but they were absolutely out of sight, as they are still today in the US. Very few people talk about their plight, in part because the black-white conflict really, I think, eats up a lot of the energy around questions of social justice, whereas in Canada, the ethno-linguistic divide has really receded in importance, and all the attention now is put on the tensions between First Nations and the settlers. So there's a history to how these various issues are becoming forefronted and backfronted. The case of black Canadians is just emerging now as an issue that is gaining more salience, but it's going to be a long time before, and I think it will never reach the salience that it has in the US. So I think using the term recognition gap was really to point to the fact that here we're talking about universal phenomena that are based on different types of characteristics in different national contexts. And our book, Getting Respect, looked at black people in three contexts, African American, black Brazilians, and Ethiopian Jews in Israel, to show how the construction of blackness in the three countries varied drastically and really influenced how black people in the three countries experienced rejection. So that Ethiopian Jews kept saying, but we are Jewish, we're part of us, we are stigmatized, we know that we experience racism, but yet one day we'll be part of them, part of us, because we're Jewish, we were invited to come here, which is certainly gives them hope, form of hope that Palestinian counterparts, Palestinian citizens of Israel, just shut up because they have no hope whatsoever. So I think that's the kind of thing that I wanted to highlight. Now, would I use this to talk about relationships between, Latvia and Russia? Probably not. I don't know. I'm not an expert of world system theory, but I would probably be reluctant to use this at the same scale as the analysis of white supremacy or settler colonialism. Yeah.
We learned that desperation is lethal and that you need, I hope, to open up an avenue to the future. Thank you very much for allowing us a glimpse in your book in progress and also expanding on some of your ideas here in the discussion with the audience. Liebes Publikum, ich darf Sie mit frommen Weihnachtswünschen entlassen und mit der Hoffnung, dass das nächste Jahr gut für Sie beginnt. Vor allen Dingen aber die frohe Botschaft schon jetzt verkünden, dass die Mosse-Lectures weitergehen im Januar. Dann wird Mike Savage bei uns zu Gast sein und sprechen über die Importance of Class in an Age of Inequality. Patrick Eiden-Offe wird den Abend moderieren. Ich würde mich sehr freuen, wenn Sie uns auch in 2020 treu bleiben. Bleiben Sie gesund und kommen Sie jetzt vor allen Dingen gut nach Hause. Großen Dank für Ihr Dasein.